All right, Nick. Hey,
Hi.
how you been?
I've been great. How have you been?
Pretty good. All right, we're going to talk about religion in a different kind of way.
Yes, absolutely. So, I'd like to discuss religion from a behavioral point of view, a behavior analytical point of view. So, looking at religion and religious behaviors that people engage in, and then trying to analyze why they do what they do, and then further just looking at the idea of operationalizing or codifying religion into something that can be applied across the board instead of something that's very subjective and personal and whatever one person thinks can be totally different from somebody else. So,
Right. Yeah, well, can you go through exactly what you would define codifying it as?
So, codifying within the field of behavior analysis, we have this concept of the operational definition. And what that is that you take a behavior and you write just a clear and concise and measurable description of it so that anybody who is reading it knows exactly what you're talking about. So, for example, if I'm talking about something like prayer. So currently, if you look at prayer, it's something that is incredibly subjective. One person might think that you have to close your eyes and bow your head, and another person might pray with their eyes open. One person might have a actual dialogue where they're having a one-sided conversation, whereas another person might speak for God because God is speaking through them. One person might do it silently in their head. One person might visualize it. It's just completely subjective and contingent on one's own interpretation or definition of what prayer is. Whereas codification, if we operationally defined prayer, we would put exactly what prayer is, which would be a verbal conversation with a higher power. And then we would give examples of what prayer looks like as well as non-examples so that people know, so this is exactly what prayer is, and then this is not an instance of prayer. So that would be operationally defining a religious concept. The other behavioral concepts that I would like to explore is the concept of functions of our behavior. So basically just exploring the why behind what we do. So for prayer, I'll take that example again. One person might say that the reason they are doing it is to talk to God. But if we really start to break it down and analyze the why behind it, behavioral science has found 4 different functions of behavior that people basically the whys behind what they do. We either do it to escape something, we do it to gain something, we do it to get attention, or we do it to for sensory stimulation because it feels good. So looking at the concept of prayer, a person might say, well, I am praying because I am talking to God. When in reality, the function behind that behavior of prayer might be to escape something like anxiety. Maybe they're stressed out and talking to God helps them to feel better. So really the reason they did it was to escape from the anxiety. That's the function that behavior plays. Or maybe they're doing it to get something. Maybe they really want something and they're praying to God to ask for it. So ultimately the function is to get something. So just being able to look at religious behaviors and analyze them functionally and get beyond what people say the actual reason is and look at the actual reason for their behavior on a much more base level.
Now, what would self-reflection be defined as? The reason behind why one would self-reflect?
So functional analysis of self-reflection. Now, I do need to throw out a caveat. The field of behavior analysis does not touch on what we call private events, which are thoughts. Ultimately, if you cannot see it, if you cannot measure it, then we do not touch on it. So unfortunately, for things like religion, this is really why it's not been explored, is just because it relies so heavily on internal events. But that being said, the founders of the field, B.F. Skinner, and then some of the more recent behavioral scientists have come up with ways to understand what they call verbal behavior, which goes beyond just the words that we say. Ultimately, verbal behavior can also encompass private events as well, things like self-reflection and whatnot. The way you would have to understand it is just that self-reflection would be, it ultimately can be verbalized out loud so that we can measure it, we just can't hear it. But you could speak those words out loud, so ultimately it is a measurable event. So I just throw that out there because I will have to be a bit creative in some of my answers. And so I just want to note the limitations of the field and the scope of practice, and just note that as I tackle private events like self-reflection, something that usually is silent, I'm going to have to analyze it almost as if the person was speaking these words. So that being said, another very important thing when you're trying to analyze the function is figuring out an antecedent to this behavior. So what happened right before this event of self-reflection that maybe caused it? That's usually how we figure out why the behavior occurred. So looking at something like self-reflection, I would have to ask what immediately happened before that precipitated the self-reflection. So, for example, did you get in trouble or do something that you're not supposed to do? So now you're self-reflecting to try to brainstorm or think of ways to do it better, or analyze, am I a good person? Am I staying on track? Or is it rather that you are doing it for your own gratification? Maybe you're alone, and just for your own self-knowledge, you want to know. I mean, I would need to know, because if that's the case, then you're trying to gain something, which would be greater self-understanding. Whereas if you are doing it because you need to analyze how to better do something, then you're trying to escape from things like shame or guilt or whatnot. So it really depends on what happened prior.
Okay, well, so then the wanting to become a better person, to better yourself, would fit into the gain category?
Sure.
Okay.
It can, but it also can be, again, alleviation of guilt. Because if you feel like you're not a good enough person, then ultimately the function can be to escape from that cognitive dissonance. So I would say that if you are doing it just for your own self-gratification, then by nature that would, one, be sensory. If you enjoy thinking, you enjoy being in your head, it's gratifying, then you're doing it just because it feels good. Because you love learning. You love learning new things, love learning and analyzing yourself. So it could be that. I know for myself, that's very much a function of my behaviors. I do self-reflection not because I'm trying to be a better person, but because it's interesting and I enjoy it. So it could be something as simple as that, but it just depends on the person and what happened before and what's the outcome that they're looking for.
Right. Okay. I just wanted to see where that category of prayer would fit into.
And looking at prayer from a functional point of view, I've found it very interesting how much it parallels a psychological phenomenon called self-talk, which is something that people tend to do when a task is too difficult for them and they tend to become more stressed out. They will talk themselves through it. And I find that very interesting that prayer can tend to almost mirror that it tends to arise when a situation is too difficult for us, when we are trying to brainstorm solutions, and so we ask God to give us a solution, but then we continue to talk, whether it's for God or for ourselves, through the issue until we have come to a conclusion, and then we feel gratification at the end of that because we solved the problem. very similar to the concept of self-talk. And self-talk, as people develop throughout the lifespan, it tends to become internal. But we see it a lot in kids when they're first learning, and then to a degree, even as adults, when things are more stressful or we don't know how to handle it, we can see that resurface in an audible manner. So it's just very interesting to look at, again, that function of prayer in that form would be either to get something because we're trying to find a way to get it, and then also to a degree to escape from something, from that uncertainty and the anxiety that it brings. So ultimately, the function would probably be escape.
Yeah, well, in self-talk and prayer, basically the same thing, other than in prayer you're talking to someone else.
Sure. At least that's what we think in that moment, and there very well could be a psychological benefit of feeling like you're not alone in that moment, feeling like there's somebody else who is helping you solve the problem. But once again, it still is escape. It alleviates that anxiety of having to do something alone. So ultimately, any of these types of behaviors that ends up alleviating something, the function is going to be escape. And further, another concept that we discuss in behavioral science is the concept of reinforcement, that if something is reinforcing, we tend to keep doing it. We learn that we should repeat this. So any behavior that alleviates anxiety, we would call that negative reinforcement. So because something awful was alleviated, we are now more likely to keep doing that. So not only does it serve a function of escape, it also can be a learned behavior that's been reinforced because it reduces anxiety or stress or fear of the unknown.
And okay, so with your idea of codifying the religious processes,
sure,
I assume that you would consider that to be a benefit then.
So the field of applied behavioral analysis stresses the fact that we are not experimental scientists, we are applied scientists. So we are absolutely, anything that we research and that we try to understand needs to be applied to make socially significant behavioral change in somebody's life. So basically, we need to be making people's lives better with what we find. We're not interested in sitting in a laboratory and teaching rats to press levers or pigeons to peck buttons. We actually want to help people. So as I look at codifying the concept of religion, I think that it absolutely would be beneficial to certain people. And I think the type of person who would benefit from a clear and concise and just the same across the board definition of these concepts, things like prayer, things like worship, things like, even just following the different rules and just whatnot, I think it would benefit the types of people whose functions are escape. So people who are coming to religion to alleviate anxiety or stress or fear or whatnot, what I see happening is that on an applied level, within the many churches that I have been to and witnessed, I see that the average person is coming in, one, to escape from the negative things in life, and then two, to get something, usually social support, not having to be alone through the struggle. So as I look at that dynamic, what I tend to see is that there's a lot of anxiety and fear because these religious terms are so subjectively and whimsically defined. You can find any support for whatever view you want by picking and choosing a Bible verse to support your view. Yes. Yeah. And so then people who are in positions of authority or power in the church will say that prayer needs to look like this. But to somebody who is coming in to just get alleviation of their anxiety, that can actually be very anxiety inducing. I remembered a individual that I met who just felt extreme shame and stress because he couldn't hear God's voice when he prayed, and therefore he was a bad Christian, and he needed to work harder and he needed to try harder because everybody else was talking about hearing God's voice and he never heard it. But it's well known that the way that we process our thoughts internally is different depending on the way your brain is wired. Some people think in pictures. Some people don't have a running narrative. And then other people's thoughts are auditory. They hear them almost like a voice. And so as a result, if you're a visual processor, it's not possible to hear God's voice. So this individual was left in a very bad position where they felt shamed and they felt like they were a bad Christian. Maybe they were going to go to hell because they couldn't hear God's voice like everybody else could. Whereas if we codified this concept of prayer, for example, and allowed for both visual and auditory components of it, so prayer being either auditorily speaking to God or visually interacting with him, then within that manner, we can alleviate that anxiety that I'm not engaging in prayer and help people to know closer what to do. So I know there's been attempts to codify prayers, things like the Lord's Prayer or whatever, this is how you should pray, but unfortunately it just does not touch on the psychological and behavioral processes. So if we note that examples of prayer can include kneeling or standing, eyes open or eyes closed, I mean, if we just codify that all of these count as examples of prayer, and this is the variety, however, these varieties that we have selected are what prayer is, then I think we can alleviate that anxiety and that fear that comes from the unknown. However, I think that then raises the question of who will accept this codified.
Yeah, that's where I was getting ready to ask you, and I don't want to take my question too far because it will end up taking us someplace we don't
absolutely
want to go, but I think it's an important question is, if you, so let's use a hypothetical real quick.
Sure.
Yeah, you have someone come in who is struggling with this, however that would work, and you do get this individual, and let's say they're a minor, to accept this codification of the religious processes, but they're still going to their church.
Mm-hmm.
And they're still told that's not correct because the church itself has not accepted these codifications.
Right.
So how would you go about that?
So going back to a functional analysis, escape would be a very common one for why people come in, but the other function is for social support. So to get something. And oftentimes that social support is more important than the alleviation of anxiety. People would rather keep it to themselves and worry as long as they still are part of this group. And the unfortunate thing is we really start to dig into analyzing religious behaviors. I think what we're going to find is that there are certain people who engage in these behaviors because they get something out of it. So let's say you go to the church and you are in a position of authority, and now all of a sudden people listen to you and you have power and whatnot. So your religious behaviors are contingent on you getting something. So if we codify religion in a way that does not allow you to be the one in power, or determining what prayer looks like, I think that we will see a major backlash against that just because somebody is losing power, and so they're going to engage in whatever behaviors to get that power back.
What would you say to, and I know in the common individual, the power is still in their own mind, but for some, because it is in the religious teachings, especially for Christianity, that even though you are like the head of a church or whatnot, you are not the one in power. It is still God who is in power.
But
that's what I'm saying. The common individual doesn't...
And that's where the functions of behavior come in, because somebody will say that they are doing God's work. They will say that God told them. I have witnessed this personally, where God told somebody that I was not allowed to play music at the church because God said I wasn't ready. However, all the attractive girls were allowed to play with this individual.
Yeah. You allow me to give you an example too, real
absolutely.
quick, because I had a guest on quite a while ago, and he told a story about how he went to he was talked into going to the Pentecostal church, and they were doing their power of Christ or whatever with the hand on the head, and you are now saved and whatnot. And they got to him, the priest or pastor or whatever he was, put his hand on Josh's head and told him he could not be saved. So, I mean...
Because God ordained it. Right, yes. And so ultimately somebody in power is going to say, and this is why, again, I just would find it so interesting and beneficial to analyze the actual functions of these behaviors, because they're not often what people say they are. And the person might even believe, they might in their own mind believe that it's true, that God really did say this person can't be saved or that I'm not ready. But when it comes down to it, that's not an acceptable explanation for why they did what they did. When it comes down to it, it's because they got something out of it, because it was reinforcing, and letting go of that power is not reinforcing, so therefore they're going to hold on to it and do whatever they can to keep it.
Yeah, what would you say to, because I know your solution is the codification, but on the opposite side, there is, actually reading the Bible, which isn't always helpful, but for the example of you cannot be saved, obviously we know in the Bible that the priest does not have that power to say that. So you could also use that as a solution. Be knowledgeable about also what you are practicing.
But even so,
they wouldn't have that power.
They will find some way to get around it. People will always find a way to get what they want.
And they can always remove you from the church.
Yes, they can. Yep. And so ultimately what I see being a beneficial if you are going to maintain religion is within a situation like that, you're not going to change it. People have to have an incentive. They have to want to change. And if you do not want to change, it's not going to happen. You can't force people to change. So I think what you would have to do is ultimately start anew with a codified version. Codification should occur for the psychological practices that the religious practices that provide psychological aid. That's where I see codification occurring, because
what exactly would those be?
So things like prayer, things that will help with self-esteem, things that will give you a sense of purpose in life, any and all of those things that we recognize are psychologically healthy, that people do with or without religion. But just looking at basically psychological interventions that are wrapped up in a religious package, that's fine and acceptable. I think ritual is already codified. That's not really, if you are just going for the cultural, I don't see any issue with that. If you go to a Catholic church and there's the standing and the sitting and the certain response psalms and whatnot, that's already codified. So that's not an issue. It's more the personal things that we apply to our lives in an attempt to alleviate some negative psychological factor or to help with some negative life event. Those are the ones I would want to see codified. And I think the opposition that arises really will just come from people who benefit from skewing that codification to meet their own agenda. But I think if we could just things like a sense of purpose in life. I think religion tends to give people, there's a reason that evolutionary materialism does not give you. Evolutionary materialism would be that we don't have worth, that we are here to reproduce, and once we have done that, we will die.
By the way, we need to have we need to do one on that.
Absolutely. But most people, I mean, that's my worldview. That's what I believe. And yet I can't even practice like that. I, for all intents and purposes, live my life as if I were a Christian, as if every life is valuable, as if there is a reason to be good to other people. Things like staying faithful to your spouse or family, or, things that evolutionary materialism would not tell you to do. So, I recognize that that's not a viable worldview or option for people, which is why I think the concept of codifying religion, or at least religious tools, if you will, would be beneficial, because it can allow people to do things, like I think a really good example of something that we have codified, and we accept it in the behavioral sciences as well, because I know we practice it at the clinic I work at, mindfulness. So concepts of meditation, they have, and then just mindfulness, of being aware of where we are in the moment, divorcing ourselves from the thoughts and the worries and just focusing on the now. That is a religious tool that we have borrowed and we have now used to help people psychologically, and it's very beneficial. It works. I've used it at the clinic, and it makes a big difference. But the thing is that it's not this subjective. We have curriculums, we have things that very specifically give you detailed scientific steps on how to practice mindfulness. It gives you the varieties, ones of you can be mindful of your physical sensations, you can be mindful of stimuli in the environment, just anything to pull you out of worrying about the past or worrying about the future, and just into the here and now. So that's a perfect example of how a very subjective religious concept has been turned into something very objective, codified, and used to help people with just to help them psychologically. So if we could take the same concept and apply it to tools like prayer, looking at it as a form of self-talk, or a sensation of not feeling alone, or being able to find a sense of purpose in life. So instead of just taking the concept of do unto others as you would to yourself, using that as a sense of purpose in life. I wouldn't want to feel awful. I know when I was going through this bad thing and nobody helped me, it sucked, so I don't want anybody else to have to do that. That alone is a sense of purpose in life. So just taking these things, codifying them, and using them in an intentional manner, I think that would benefit people, even if they want to keep their religious framework, that there is some higher power or whatnot who is making sense of this. I mean, I don't really have a problem with that. I don't agree with it, but I think it's fine as long as we know what we're doing intentionally, instead of just throwing it out there like, well, you should pray. What is prayer? I don't know, but you should do it. God has a plan for you. What is that plan? I don't know, but it's there. How about we give people steps? Like, here's what you can do to identify this plan, these goals. That's something we do in psychology, setting goals. Okay, and then further, how do I achieve them? Well, you trust God and you pray and he'll take care of it. Or we can give people steps to achieve these goals. Ultimately, we can just make it much more focused on helping people move forward, even if it's still packaged in a religious manner or a spiritual manner. I don't care. If that's what you need, that's fine. But let's just be intentional. Let's be direct. Let's find something that's actually going to make a difference, instead of, well, you should do this, or just kind of try it. I guess a example that I could use from just my clinical work is I have observed families that are trying to cope with difficult things, and they've got all these coping skills that they've figured out, but because they don't really know how to apply them intentionally, they just scroll through all the different, does this work? No. Does this? Well, how about this coping technique? How about this? Whereas when I come in, I can just pinpoint right away, this is what's going on, this is exactly what you need to use. So let's say somebody's having anxiety and they're worried. What if they're worried about an unknown in the future. So what if we utilized mindfulness as a form of meditation, or so that to help them to get out of that future worry and focused on the now? Or what if we used prayer as a form of self-talk, where they are working through each individual step of things that they can do to take care of the situation, to problem solve? Why not apply these religious concepts to individuals who still need that religion, who are still benefiting from the social aspect of it, but just give them those tools in a codified manner to directly help them to reduce whatever it is they're trying to escape from functionally, instead of leaving them to subjectively try to guess what tool will work best, which often doesn't help.
All right, and so to get a more in-depth picture of what exactly the benefits of doing this would be, what exactly would be the benefit between identifying prayer as a form of self-talk instead of prayer?
The benefit would be that we know how to apply prayer in an intentional manner. So if the function of prayer is to alleviate anxiety from an unknown, then we would apply prayer as a form of self-talk for problem solving. Whereas like another concept that I see in the psychological literature is gratefulness, being able to focus on the positive and be thankful for what we have. So prayer could also be applied as a form of gratefulness, just being thankful for the things that are good in our lives and focusing on the positive, priming those positive parts of our psyches. So the format of prayer and the way that we utilize it, if we can, again, codify it instead of just this blanket of prayer, that can be whatever you want it to be, depending on whatever the function is. If we have it codified, then we would know that prayer as a form of problem-solving self-talk would be applied to anxiety reduction and problem-solving, whereas prayer as gratefulness as a form of positivity to prime your day, to focus on the things we should be thankful for.
And so then to clarify, just so everyone understands that, I think what I'm getting from this is you're not saying get away with prayer and replace it with self-talk. You are saying identify prayer as a form of self-talk, expand upon it to use it in these applied circumstances.
Functionally appropriate way. As opposed to we have this blanket prayer, and this blanket concept of prayer can be anything, and so therefore people don't know what to do intentionally to use it, and helping them instead to identify this is the function, so here's how I can functionally and practically use prayer to achieve what I need, instead of leaving them subjectively and ambiguously scrolling through, pleading and begging, and, well, if I thank God, maybe that'll work. Because, I mean, you scroll through it. You scroll through that process of, well, let's see, I need help with this tough situation I'm going through. God, do you have advice? No. God, can you talk me through it? That didn't work. God, I'm going to praise you, because maybe if I didn't praise you enough, maybe that's why I didn't get this. So ultimately, rather than scrolling through, we have a codified, okay, so this is what I need. This is what I need to apply to get to that, to get from point A to B very quickly, as opposed to taking the scenic route.
Okay, yeah, I think I understand that a lot better now. And really, it actually kind of sounds like a good idea. It seems like,
Oh, thank you.
I know we've had so many disagreements on this, but we haven't sat down and really got this in depth to it. So, because I actually always thought you meant get rid of prayer and replace it with teaching people self-talk rather than prayer. But it is self-talk, but a prayer form of self-talk.
Yes, right. Absolutely.
And so, I mean, to give a really dumbed down explanation is like when we used to believe that if the crops didn't grow, it's because we didn't sacrifice a good enough virgin to the volcano gods, and then we turned that into a more benign thing of prayer, which was more helpful than throwing the virgin in the volcano. But now let's make it even better.
More helpful than that would be understanding how to plant crops and when, and just getting a science of agriculture.
Right.
would be the most beneficial.
Which we eventually,
right,
we did.
Yes. Because that gets rid of extraneous variables. But I think one of the things that's become very clear to me in this field is emotion. That I can have all of the answers for what a parent needs to do. Let's say, for example, that a kid is having, let's say I'm trying to help them with a kid who's tantruming over something, and the answer to it is to ignore it, and it will go away. But I try to present this to the parent, and they're not going to do it. They can't, because they can't ignore their child for 2 hours,
right?
Because their child's in distress, and your instinct is to go and comfort. So even though that's the most effective answer, that's not the most socially valid answer, because the parents will never go for it. So instead, what I have to do is a graduated extinction process, which is you let them cry for 5 minutes, and then you go in and prompt them what they can do instead of crying, and then you wait another 5 minutes and then continue to prompt. So that way you're still working with the child, encouraging them. It's more positive based. It's less effective than just straight up putting it on extinction and ignoring it, but it'll never work. So in the same way, would it be more effective, just logically speaking, no emotion, would it be more effective to do away with religion? Yes. Because it's always going to be an extraneous extra step that is mirroring a psychological intervention that would be much quicker without it. However, that's not a socially valid answer, because for most people, they need religion.
Well, I don't know if it's a psychologically valid answer either. Which is kind of a weird thing for me to say to you, but because, okay, obviously we created religion.
Sure.
There was a purpose for it, and I don't think it was just to explain
not
those
at all.
things, and because we didn't understand the psychology behind it. But not everyone, but I think there are some people who literally cannot function or would not be able to function with the non-religious world.
But that's exactly what I'm saying, is that just logically speaking, because that is not logical, but logically speaking, we would be better without it. But that's disregarding everything we know about humanity, which is why it's not a socially valid. So even if it is the most effective, it's really not, because it's not feasible.
Right.
When you look at how humans actually work, there's many things in the lab that are the most effective, but I mean, really, if you want to get into it, the most effective is positive punishment. Scaring something or punishing something out of somebody is the quickest way to reduce a behavior, but in the real world, that's not going to be effective, because people don't learn from that. They just learn to avoid whatever it is that gives them the punishment. They don't actually learn how to do it.
That's true.
So ultimately, that in the same vein, just because something is the most effective does not mean that it's actually going to be, or the quickest way to get something done doesn't mean it's necessarily going to be actually the most effective in a real world, not a laboratory setting, because the real world works very differently than a controlled laboratory environment. So you have to think about those extraneous social variables, which is why I would say, again, at this point, our best benefit would be to codify, to give people a direct intervention to intervene with whatever is ailing them in a religious manner, because that would be, to me, the most important thing, is to alleviate suffering from people, to help them to use religion in a intentional way, as opposed to a subjective, just scrolling through different things, trying, desperately hoping, and then becoming discouraged when it didn't work.
Well, because you said that the purpose behind it, for you at least, would be to alleviate suffering.
Yes.
What would you say to people who would say that in general, suffering is a positive and, in certain ways, and a...
I think I know where you're going with that. And what I would say is that from an evolutionary perspective, suffering has a role to spur us to move away from it. Because it's punishing, it teaches us not to do that again. But the unfortunate thing about evolution is that it's not smart. It's not intentional. It didn't build in just enough suffering to spur us on, but then the ability to turn it off. It doesn't factor in the fact that sometimes people are stuck in situations that they can't get out of, and so therefore it turns on the suffering, if you will, the negative emotions and the pain and the hurt and whatever, full force, and then just leaves the faucet running to the point where it overflows from the sink and spills over everywhere and just drowns you because it didn't build in a shutoff. It did not factor in the fact that sometimes it will be non-functional and it can be turned on and then left on, which ultimately ends up destroying you. So its purpose, which was to keep you alive, it became the thing that it was trying to prevent. So ultimately, that's what I would say negative experiences are supposed to teach us to not repeat them. But if we're stuck in a situation where we have to repeat them, then it loses its purpose,
right,
and becomes non-functional.
And then I guess you could say that your job would be then to, they lived that suffering, they experienced that suffering, but then you're teaching them how to
alleviate it.
Right.
Sure.
Yeah.
Now, I think the big question that I have for you is the concept of creativity and okay, so like I come from a musical background, and I know that form and theory can only take you so far. Whereas if you do not have creativity or going beyond the theory and beyond the form, if you don't listen to your emotions and if you don't listen to that creative spark, you will never be able to compose or really use music in a meaningful manner. So there has to be a step away from that codification, if you will. So to draw that analogy to what we've been talking about, I wonder if a clinical approach to religion would stifle some of the meaningfulness of the spontaneity of it and the emotional experience of it.
I think that taking a purely logical, scientific, psychological view, well, not psychological, but logical and scientific view of religion, it does. It would, at least for some people, because, at least for me, in my experiences in quite a few people I've talked to, is part of religion is, it's a journey somewhat. Sure, and it's more for people who don't have someone else telling them what it is in their ear. And I think that is one of the biggest issues, is them not discovering what it is for themselves. Sure. And I think that's an important part of Christianity, not to get into this, but is that the whole point of it was it's a personal relationship between you and God, and, so you define what that is.
Sure. Not
someone else. But, yeah, I think it's a huge benefit to be able to look at religion through your own eyes, come to your own conclusions about it. And I think if you do have that codification or whatever people want to call it, it could take away from things that people could learn by doing that process, that other process, that creative thinking process, rather than a list of this is what this is, this is what this is, you know what I mean?
So do you think then if we limit the codification to interventions to alleviate, pointed, direct interventions to quickly alleviate suffering or problem solve, but then leave the relational aspect of it alone? But even then, I wonder if we still shouldn't, to a degree, codify that relational aspect, because again, that concept of God talking to me versus some people don't hear the auditory, and so I still think we need a codification just to help people understand the varieties of religious experiences, and that it's okay to have a diverse experience. The other thing that I wonder too, being able to help people, just like, for example, I mentioned one of the things that draws people to religion is the idea of the social support and interaction. But I think what this tends to become is we get this blanket statement of you need to go to church.
Yeah.
And that's what it comes into, is then you have these people who are working 5, maybe 6 days a week, and then on the day when they're supposed to be resting, they have to go to church because that's what you're supposed to do. But in what we know with introversion versus extroversion, that's very much an extrovert's rule. Whereas to an introvert, I mean, that might absolutely wear them out and exhaust them and take away. And especially if you're also supposed to go Sunday morning, Sunday night, Bible study on Wednesday, choir practice Thursday, I mean, by the time that you're done, you're just wearing yourself out and not actually getting the benefit. Whereas what if we helped people to understand that religious, and you can find biblical support for this, the concept of if one or two are gathered in my name, but just this concept of helping people to understand that it's not going to church. That's the benefit. I mean, of course, your church wants you to believe that it is, because it, one, ups their numbers, and two, if you're giving money during the service, so of course, because they're getting something, they're going to try to tell you that's what you have to do. But at the same time, if we can help people to understand that having a meaningful, what if you got lunch with or breakfast with your pastor on, or even just went to lunch with your pastor one day a week, and you just had a meaningful talk for 30 minutes about religious concepts? What if you just go to a small group Bible study where it's 3 or 4 other people and it's just a quiet discussion, versus the more extroverted, all right, I need you all to go greet each other and shake hands, and the introvert's like, no, don't look at me. Yeah. What if we help them to understand that a 30-minute small group discussion is just as meaningful and probably more beneficial to your health, your psychological health, than going to a big church service with, anywhere from 20, 30 to thousands of people, which can be overwhelming. What if we helped people to understand that small groups are just as meaningful? So helping them to look at what is going to directly help them, as opposed to the blanket statement of the church just saying this is what you need to do.
Yeah, well, in terms of the church, it's mostly because just the extent that our society has grown and the way that we've changed from living in these small towns to large cities. The church, was that center of the community, and all of that for that social aspect. But now we have, like in my town, so many different churches.
Exactly.
It kind of now, I mean, in a way, the center of the community has, it's been split. It's not really there because there's so many different ones. But what was the last thing that you said?
I mean, really, I was just talking about the fact that if we could help people figure what they individually need.
Yeah. I think the most beneficial thing in today's world that we live in is to sit down, like we are, with people that have either similar, religious views to yourself or different, and have serious conversations, like you said, with the pastor about those things to help figure out where to go from there.
I really like that. So one thing that I've thought about was, what if we had mental health clinicians in the church? And I know that's not feasible for all the little churches where there's maybe 10 to 15 people and it's a little dying church, but like the ones that are, at least a couple hundred people or whatnot, what if we actually did have mental health clinicians? And I know pastors, especially once they've hit the master's level, are able to do pastoral counseling. And even at the bachelor level, I know, like, my dad did counseling, and he's just got his bachelor's in ministry, but either working with the pastor, because there's no way that having a bachelor's in ministry, you're actually able to help with mental health concerns. I mean, as a bachelor's of psychology, taking courses in abnormal psychology and knowing how the mind actually works, I'm still not allowed to practice and do counseling until I get my master's. So why on earth are we saying that this person who's taken no courses in it is equipped to be a mental health counselor, basically? I mean, yes, it's a spiritual counselor, but really it is a mental health counselor, because you're doing marriage and family therapy. You're dealing with cognitive behavioral therapy for anxiety and depression. When people are coming in with those, you're doing behavioral therapy if people are having behavioral problems and they don't know what to do with their kid. I mean, and you're just not qualified for that. So either one, equipping pastors to be able to do that, or two, just starting to, as clinicians, be at the church to where the pastor is either referring you out to a clinician or having an in-church clinician that's paid to be able to function in that role. But the biggest thing would just have to be that sensitivity, because the biggest caveat is sending it out to a psychologist. The fear that what I hear, this fear is that people are like, well, they went to college and college is going to try to turn you away from God. I mean, I had people warn me of that, like, don't go to college, don't listen to your... I went to a Christian college, and both of them were Christian colleges, and these people still were like, oh, they're going to try to turn you away from God, be careful, it's a Christian college. But, so I know there can be that fear of going to a mental health clinician, of, well, they're going to take a scientific approach as opposed to a religious, whereas if there are clinicians who are specifically trained to be sensitive about that and help people to find that guided self-discovery of how religion can personally benefit them the best and be the most effective for them, that's honestly a role that I wouldn't even mind with my views on religion. I would probably classify myself as an anti-theist, to be fair, and my views on just life being evolutionary materialistic monism, but I still would not have any qualms about implementing the things that I've discussed. If I've got a client, and I have several actually, that'll bring up religious things, I don't sit there and just go, oh, that's not science, here's a better intervention. I will try to use it in terms they can understand, but point it towards an effective solution. So I think that would be the biggest benefit. I think the biggest barrier I see to that would again be that control thing, where if the pastor does not want you to benefit the most from religion, if they're interested in the church or themselves benefiting the most by you listening to them, that's where you would find pastors who don't want somebody else. Because if you being afraid, like I've seen pastors of this mentality, they want people to be afraid, they want people to be scared, so that those people then, donate money or give them whatever they want because you're afraid of going to hell. And so, I mean, there's definitely that approach, and I don't think they would ever accept psychological help in that type of church. But in the type of church where the pastor, and the majority of churches that I have gone to, this is the case, the pastor's not power hungry, he or she is not looking at it to manipulate or control. They genuinely have a good heart, they want to help people, they want to do ministry because they want to help people. And so if you can team up with that type of individual and help them to be able to just pointedly and directly alleviate their suffering, instead of, you come into the pastor and say, I have this issue, help. And the pastor's like, because I've had this happen, just asking pastors and religious people for help, and they say, I honestly don't know how to handle that, I'm sorry. I guess you gotta trust God or whatever, but I don't have the tools to help you. What if we had people in there who did have the tools and they were still religiously sensitive? That's actually something that's coming up in both of my classes, graduate classes that I'm taking right now, is we have to do assignments on diversity for different cultures. That even if your scientific evidence-based intervention is the most effective, sometimes you got to alter it and pick a less effective one because that will fit better with the client's culture. So if the client's culture is religious, even if it's slightly less effective than the most effective intervention, but it at least will be sensitive to their needs, I mean, yeah, absolutely go with that intervention, because that's going to help them more than one that just absolutely sweeps their culture. And I'm accepting religion as a form of culture just for this point. Just being sensitive to their background and using terms they understand but still being pointed and direct, that might be a much better solution for helping people.
Maybe they should pastors, heads of churches, or whatever, you should start requiring them to take that, where they're equipped to do all those things. Because like you said, I mean, the pastor is supposed to be like the person that, you go to
Right.
and all that. And I think you're right, where in many of the churches, you probably would have pastors that would not want a second person, because then that person is the person that they go to.
Right. But in the churches that I've been to where they are genuinely good people who have a heart, behaviorists, evolutionary scientists don't say heart, who have a mind to help people.
I mean, we don't keep our feelings in our heart.
Right, yes. But that those who really have a passion for helping other people, they want that input. They want to. It's just they don't know how. And so I think just being able to help within that capacity, I think that alone would be a major benefit for a lot of people. So if you cannot eradicate it, which I don't foresee that being possible, I would say then at least go in and try to help as best as you can, and in terms that people understand, but just helping them to be direct and intentional about it instead of just subjective. And because the advice I know I've gotten in the past, and I know other people have as well, things like trust God, pray, read your Bible, and it'll give you the answer. The thing is, no, it really won't.
That's true. And
whereas, go ahead.
Trust God, read the Bible, that doesn't really help. You're right. It's not those things that you're doing that will help, but it is your own mind, utilizing your own mind while doing those things in the correct way, that can help you.
Now, I think another important aspect too, that would benefit is just the recognition of mental health differences. So like biological psychology, that course that I had to take in my undergrad, helped me to understand that a lot of it is not a choice. That there are deficits that if a system is not working in your brain, it is not there. That you are not choosing to be a bad person, and you just need to choose to do the right thing. That a lot of the times people are not choosing to be sinners, but that there really is something that's not working correctly in their brain. So for example, the field that I work in is autism, and a lot of our kids have meltdowns where they will rage and scream and flip tables, and just extremely aggressive. And from a religious standpoint, these people would be choosing to be sinners, and they're needing to repent of their aggressive, angry behaviors and choose to calm down and make the right choice. And that's just absurd. It's obscene, because we know, within our field, we don't label behaviors as bad or good. We label them as functional or non-functional. So none of these kids who are having these meltdowns are choosing to be bad. It's because they don't have the words. So like my kid who was sick, he didn't have the words to say, I feel sick. I don't feel good. All that he had was he threw himself on the floor and started sobbing and hitting at me and kicking and whatnot because he did not have the words. So according to a religious perspective, he's choosing to be bad and he's choosing to have a tantrum and he needs to repent. Whereas I understand autism is a communication. It's very difficult because of some of it's learning, some of it is just like social learning, what we take for granted, that our brains just pick up on it because of the way that we develop. If you don't have that, if you don't have a system that's drawing you towards watching people learn stuff and you miss out on that, how is that your fault? That's your brain not functioning like it should. But then as I look at it, it's not a bad behavior. This poor child is sick, and I need to help teach him. Obviously not in that moment because he was distressed. He got a hug. And comforted and whatnot. But just then teaching him over time the words to say, I don't feel good, because he just did not have those. And so as I look at religion, again, this concept of you're just being bad, and you need to choose. But then looking at all these different disorders of our brains, some people don't have that capacity. They do not have the words. They do not know. Or say like ADHD. I mean, I have seen kids who are just off the wall destructive. I mean, you saw that when we worked together.
Yeah.
And I look at that kid, the one that, I mean, you know who I'm talking about, and just by how destructive it was. But the thing is, when they upped his medication, he was a perfect kid. I mean, very good, well-mannered, very intelligent, very creative. But because his brain was just overstimulated, I mean, he was just off the walls and destructive. He was not a bad kid who was choosing to be bad. I mean, once he got the medication, he was a good kid.
We're saying that he was that way because of ADHD. I'm
saying that the behaviors and whatnot, I mean, if my brain had that exact same, if I were walking in his shoes, if I was living with his brain, I would have done the same thing. And I would have wished somebody would have had compassion and helped me instead of just labeling me as bad. So as I look at it, I think that's another very big consideration within religion that we have to start understanding, is that it's really goes back to that just world fallacy, where if you choose to be a good person, things will work out. And if things didn't work out, it must be because you didn't choose to be a good person. It's such a simplistic view of this world and the way that it works. And I think, once again, the codification process, that's why we have the DSM. That's why we have our Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, because we've codified what these behaviors or cognitions look like. And so we're able to recognize them, diagnose them, and then provide actually helpful treatment, be that pharmacological or psychological or behavioral or whatnot. We have things set in place to actually help. And so when you get into the concept of mental illness and the fact that people are not choosing, or even depression, I mean, my God, people are depressed, and the religious view is you need to be happy. I mean, you need to be grateful for the things God has given you, and just pray and it'll go away. Or anxiety disorders, we know there's a biological basis for that, but the solution to that is don't worry. You know, God takes care of the birds in the field and the lilies, or the lilies in the field and the birds in the trees, and so he'll take care of you. Well, here's the funny thing. Flowers die very, very quickly, and so do birds, because this world will not take care of them. There's a lot of dead birds on the side of the road. So, I mean, that's not a very good point to make, that you'll be taken care of if you just don't worry about it. Whereas we know that anxiety is an overactive threat detection system where your brain is processing everything as a threat, even neutral stimuli. And so as we start to now delve into that, I mean, once again, this idea of subjectivity now becomes horrific to think about, because if you tell somebody with a mental disorder that they're going to hell if they don't shape up, and then your solution is to tell them read the Bible or pray about it or trust, then you've basically just absolutely condemned this person to hell, because they can't. They need actual help. So I think that just opens a whole nother can of worms for the need for codification and intention for actual mental health clinicians in the church, but then also just intentional interventions that are actually going to help, instead of just subjectively handing people, you know, the Bible and saying read it, or just telling them to trust that it'll work out, because that's so vague and so unhelpful.
Well, okay. So is it cool if we talk about these mental health issues real quick?
Yes.
Okay, because I am in the middle of what you're saying. I agree with the, labeling these individuals with mental disabilities or disorders, illnesses, you shouldn't do that. Like labeling the autistic kids as bad
Sure.
people because they make those choices and whatnot. But then when we talk about ADHD, depression, anxiety, I also agree with you that they shouldn't just say, be happy, get over it, read the Bible, God will handle whatever you're fretting about. But I also disagree with the notion that, well, one, that ADHD is really a disorder, and that for all three, you do absolutely need these interventions, these specific interventions to be able to deal with those, and definitely medication. I definitely disagree with taking medication for them. I mean, not always take medication, but that you need to, because I've had two of those three. Medication did not help. I mean, I didn't use religion, but I have handled those. I've handled depression indefinitely because of just thinking about it. I haven't been to a therapist in forever. I have become depressed since, but never have I been into a deep depression or suicidal since being able to learn how to handle it on my own.
So there's something that I like to call the oh shit factor. And sorry if you don't like cussing on your
That's fine.
podcast. Okay. But I call it that in that there's typical functioning, and then all of a sudden you're assessing somebody or whatnot, and they're doing fine, and then you just so happen to assess something, and you just have to say, oh shit, because it's just not there. This typically functioning system in our brain that should be working, and it's just not there. And it's so interesting how specialized it can be. You can be working with a kid and assessing them, and they are perfectly fine on every level academically, and then all of a sudden their numbers just aren't there. And you're like, wait, what? So you've got language, you've got this, but you can't do numbers? Or like their social skills are all there, but they can't initiate. And you're just like, oh my God, okay, that's not there. That is literally missing from your brain. Whatever system, whatever ability or whatnot. So I think it's easy if you are, so like ADHD, for example, what we know about it is that it is an attentional disorder. So what your brain is supposed to do is it's supposed to be able to hone in on the most important stimuli that you're attending to and then cut out everything else. But in talking to adults with ADHD that I know, I have had many of them say that's not there. Everything is equally weighted, and I have to force myself to analyze and find what I should be attending to. So if I'm in a room, I don't know what's the conversation I should be attending to, because the background conversation is equally as weighted as the conversation you and I are having. So with an ADHD, that ladybug that's been buzzing around your light bulb up there would be equally as weighted as what you and I are talking about, and I would have to intentionally take every bit of cognitive energy I have to ignore and draw my attention in and focus on you, and then it would still be drifting away to the I don't know, whatever other stimuli is here. So as you look at it, it really is a biological neurological disorder of the attentional system. What you take for granted because it works for you is not there for that person. They literally have to take every ounce of energy to be able to focus. Now that being said, ADHD is not the same as, it's an attentional disorder, but there is often co-occurring conduct disorder that happens with it as well, where there is the destructive nature. And again, that could very well be from being overstimulated. Everything is so overwhelming that you engage in destruction, but that is in and of itself, just looking at the attentional fact of ADHD, it's a real phenomenon. That's not something that you can just choose to get over.
That's where I disagree.
But once again, if you had to experience that,
I might have. So I've never been tested for anything, but so from what you just explain the experience to be like, I do that all the time. If there's people talking, I can hear every single person talking. I can't focus on a single person, but I have no problem focusing. Well, let me say that again. If there's, you mean you're having this conversation.
Sure.
Someone else is having a conversation in the back. I can't zone that out, but I have absolutely no issue having my brain retain the information of both conversations, but focusing primarily on your own. The same with the ladybug, my phone. You've seen me doing like things this whole time, but I haven't lost focus on our conversation.
But there's a difference between hyperprocessing and monotropic attention versus scattered attention. So what you're describing is not a lack of focus as much as it is a hyper-processing of every piece of stimuli. It's a very it's like the opposite condition of ADHD. So within ADHD there is no waiting. The brain does not weight things, whereas what you are saying is that the brain overweights everything. ADHD is underweighting. So like I know adults who will read a passage of a book and they cannot tell me what it's about, because the brain does not know what is an important stimuli and what's not. Everything's important. So even the citations or the description of the door is just as important as the conversation that occurred behind it. And so they would tell me about the door because their brain can't, whereas your brain can tell you what the important information is. You just hyper-process, so everything is noticed, but it's not, everything's overweighted, but it's not underweighted. So the difference is, again, if you could imagine that you could not tell what's important and what's not, because you can, but if you can't, I mean, just how debilitating that would be. And then so take what you experience and think the opposite of that, to where your brain notices everything. What if your brain noticed nothing and you had to sift through and guess?
That's what I'm getting at. Even though I would experience the opposite, I still have learned how to deal with that to function the way I want to. But what I'm saying is, even though they have that, they can still function the way they want to if they learn how.
So there's the difference in levels of severity. So you would have subclinical symptoms. Yours is not to the point to class clinically significant distress, and that is one of the diagnostic criteria of any of the mental disorders in the DSM, is that you have to have clinically significant symptoms. So like,
let's switch to my depression, because that's a better example if we're going to talk about extremes.
Okay, but to finish up on ADHD being an actual thing, it has to be debilitating, and the people that I know are debilitated by it. It's to where they can spend 8 hours reading a passage in a article and cannot, and have got nothing comprehended. And they have spent all day trying to read one passage and cannot figure out what it's about. That's debilitating. That is crippling. So can they learn strategies? Yes, but one, does their medication help them? Absolutely, I have seen the difference. Two, I mean, it's a measurable market difference in the ability to focus in. One, they take their medicine, because I've seen them in the morning and I've seen them at the end of the day. Morning, so much more alert and able to process than at night when it's worn off. And two, just that ability to, even with learning strategies, because I have helped with interventions with these adults to learn more effectively and find the information, they still struggle. What takes me 5 minutes to read will take them an hour. It still is a struggle. It's choking through it and intentionally. It's just like within autism with social stuff. Having to read other people's intentions is an agonizing like, to me, I can look at your body language, I can look at the environmental cues, and within a split second, my brain can present a hypothesis of what you're thinking or feeling.
I know.
Whereas within autism, you have to manually look at every single piece and agonizingly put it together, and by the time you've done that, the conversation's already over. So that's clinically significant, disruptive to your ability to function at work, at home, etc. So that's where, when the level of severity, because like I relate to a lot of the symptoms in autism, the monotropic attention, just the fixation on narrow little topics and being able to drone on and on for hours, even if people are bored. I mean, that's very common in autism, and I have that. But the thing is, it's not distressing to me. It's not clinically significant, and I've been able to use that to my advantage to further my knowledge. So therefore, if I were to just look at that and say, oh, that's not debilitating, but then I know probably 30 to 40 kids with autism by this point, and yes, it is debilitating when everybody else is trying to have a conversation and you don't know how to join in, so you start droning on about Minecraft. even though we switched gears 15 minutes ago. I mean, that poor kid is trying, but he has no clue how, so he just runs on about his fixation. And then people kind of just ignore it and resume the conversation. The poor kid ends up, he can't function socially because of that. So, I mean, as I look at it at a severe level, I mean, I know when to turn it on and when to turn it off. I know when it's a podcast versus when, my coworkers are trying to do their job, and it would, get in the way of that. I understand the difference. Whereas if you don't, it is clinically significant and interferes with work, home life, school, everything else. So that is the difference. So learning strategies, a lot of people do learn coping strategies, but could you imagine what if you didn't have to do that? What you're talking about with your processing and whatnot, could you imagine if you didn't have to do that? How much more efficient, which I would argue that you're actually more efficient because of it. I would call that an ability if you're able to notice all. But if it was the opposite and you were taking 8 hours to try to read a single bit of an article, I mean, could you imagine all of the extra time if you could read that in 5 minutes? I mean, oh my goodness, that's life-changing. That would be huge, because now you have all day to focus on things that you actually need to be doing or would like to do. You can further yourself and better yourself. So these things that are debilitating people are keeping them held back. If they are giving every bit and going above and beyond just to hit a normal level of functioning, that's absolutely not fair to then compare them to somebody who is at normal and has to put in a little bit of effort to go above, whereas this person is giving 300% just to get to normal, and now you're telling them you need to go above that. Otherwise, you're not trying hard enough. I mean, that's just...
Yeah, well, I would disagree with the way that people would say it. Like, if you're saying you're not trying hard enough, things like that, I agree. But I think if... Not everyone, but there are quite a few people who have the ability to, if they put in that much amount of cognitive effort to figure things out, like I had done, they could do it.
Now, I think the other difference between us is that my experience is in autism, which is a neurological, pervasive developmental disorder. You are born with it, and it is with you for the rest of your life. And, I mean, this is literally, versus where we worked before in corrections, there are literally our kids there who just should have made better choices.
Right.
And so I think, were you to see the extent of what I see, I think you would have a radically different view on actual mental disorders.
Well, I don't... Okay, I'm on board with you with autism and all that stuff. I'm just talking about... The only ones I have the opinions that I'm espousing right now are ADHD, depression, and anxiety. Those are the only three. And I still struggle with ridiculous anxieties like going out in public. But I've learned how to cope with those without anyone helping me, and that is by growing a mustache. But seriously, I did a whole episode on that, which is ridiculous. But growing my mustache helped me deal with going out in public.
But would you consider yourself smarter than most people?
I don't think so. I mean,
I disagree.
In certain aspects, like... I know that I'm on the fringe when it comes to people who like to just sit and think about things. Most people don't like to just sit and think about things. So I agree with that. I'm an abnormal in that sense. I mean, in learning about history and talking about religion and philosophical things, sure, I would say that I am probably a little higher up there than the average Joe. But in the right, I don't think so.
Even in your ability to analyze yourself, though. Did you know that the concept of self-analysis, it's tied to a part of your brain in your prefrontal cortex where both knowing what you are thinking and then knowing what other people are thinking are very closely tied processes, and not a lot of people are very good at self-analysis. So even the fact that you can look at yourself and ask, why do I do what I do? Is this effective? If not, what can I do to make it more effective? That is rare. Most people do not have that. So once again, this is an ability that you have that helps you to combat your disability.
I never did any of this until probably 5 years ago. So I lived the majority of my life without using that ability, or even knowing that I could do that I had the capacity to do that.
And I would say a similar thing in that I asked the question why, but I didn't have very good answers until my 20s, and I think that's just maturation of...
The development of the brain.
Yes, right, the brain developing and then those abilities. But even so, it just... as I look at it, my abilities to cope with things like depression and anxiety were non-existent until I, was able to self-analyze. But if you do not have that ability, if you're not a creative person who comes up with creative solutions to get over it, it really is a crippling condition.
I don't know. Well, okay, the mustache was a creative solution, but it really wasn't. Okay, so I really like exposure therapy.
Uh-huh.
I think in my own personal life and views, it has been the most effective. And the mustache thing, and the way that I started dressing, like when I dressed as supervisor, which is normally how I dress anytime I go out, and which most people would consider way overdressed. But I always try. The reason I had anxiety to go down in public was because I didn't want to be the center of attention. I didn't want to be noticed. I just want to be back and just mesh in with the crowd, because I always felt like an outlier or whatever, I guess. But then, growing the mustache, I always wanted to grow. Wearing the clothes I always wanted to wear. And then going out there. And then it didn't become a question of, were they looking at me? It was they're fucking looking at me. And then, it's just gone. Because then you expect it. Instead of wondering if it's happening, you expect it. And so I don't know if I would say it's creative or not, because it's what I always wanted to do anyway. It's just who I am. And then with the depression, though, I don't think I would call any of that creative either. I told the kids where we worked at before once, one of the kids was talking about depression or something, and I told him one of the ways that I talked myself out of suicide once was thinking about all the awesome video games that I would miss out on if I did it. And that literally was one of the reasons why I didn't kill myself once. But then, eventually it was... I can't even remember what the thought process was, but eventually just came to be able to, anytime I get depressed, which normally never happens anymore, even despite my circumstances, I already know, because I've thought about it so much that I honestly don't even know how to say it. But I wouldn't say any of them were creative solutions. They were more like pathetic solutions that worked.
I disagree with that. I would say that those are extremely creative. Uncreativity would be sitting there and staying depressed. Anything, trying things until you found something that works is creativity.
Well,
it's novel approaches to find a solution to a problem. So ultimately, it would count as creativity, just by that definition. Novel solutions, generation of novel solutions applied to a problem, and then finding one that works, and then reapplying it. And for most people, that is how they have to... That is what they end up doing. They find what works and they stick with it. But once again, that doesn't invalidate the fact that you have depression. So therefore, it's a real thing. Even if you can cope with it.
I'm not disagreeing that depression isn't a real thing. I mean, I'm not saying depression isn't a real thing.
Sure.
Well, I guess what I'm trying to say, how depression can be a genetic thing.
Yes.
But then you have, situational depression, which I think we've talked about this,
right.
Before. I don't know what I had. I would consider, I guess, mine to be situational, but both my parents have had depression and suicidal thoughts in their lives, so it could be genetic too. I don't know.
So we call that the risk factor stress model, which is that you have the risk factor for it, because somebody who has no risk factor could go through the same situations that you did and not get depressed. So it's risk factor, but then you're not guaranteed to get it unless then when that stress occurs, those events that triggered it, so it's a mix of both.
And I do recognize that people that have that physiological,
yes,
chemical imbalance in their brain that's always there is not the same as someone that has situational depression.
Right.
But I guess then what I'm saying can be easily handled is situational depression.
Sure.
And if I do have like the genetical thing, I mean, I guess you could too. I would say that I probably don't have it to the same degree. I probably definitely don't have it to the same degree that some people have. But situational depression could easily be handled just by thinking through it, in my opinion.
And once again, that's ultimately what cognitive behavioral therapy is thinking through it and teaching you to think through it and find ways to combat it. And so ultimately, yes, you are correct.
Well, that's where I wanted to tie it back into the whole religion thing we're talking about. Is even though I have these agreements with you, and I'm saying all the stuff that I'm saying, I still think that all of those things and the thought process can be helped along and quickened by these codifications and all of that.
And obviously, if I didn't believe that people can learn to work through their things, then I wouldn't have a job. Because the whole field is based on behavioral change and working with that population. So obviously I believe, but the thing is that within behavioral analysis, it is short and to the point. It's direct. We directly target what we need and we teach. We don't just look at it and say, shameful sinner, change. The rule of thumb in ABA is that you do not reduce a behavior without teaching a replacement behavior. And that's the difference between the religious approach and the scientific approach, is that the religious approach is just behavior reduction. Behavior reduction would just simply say, the religious approach would simply say, you need to get rid of this.
Right.
Whereas the behavioral approach, the intentional approach would tell you that we will help you to reduce this behavior by teaching you something to replace it. And that's where those functions come in, knowing the why behind it. So for a very classic example that we would use, that I see every day at the clinic, a kid is hungry, but they don't have the words to ask for a snack, so they just kind of wait, and then they see another kid with a snack, and they go grab their cookie. So what we do, obviously because you cannot steal, is we don't give them access to the cookie. We say no thank you, and we take the cookie and give it back to the kid, but then we prompt them, are you hungry? Say eat. And then the kid says eat, and we're like, oh, good job asking for food. Here's a cookie. And we get them their own cookie from their snack bin. So what we're doing is that we are reducing the behavior of theft, but at the same time we understand that the function is this kid's hungry and they want food, but they just don't have the words. So we're going to teach them the words so that they can ask, and then we'll give them the snack. Whereas within religion, it's just, well, you were bad for stealing, so you need to repent, and you need to figure out how to do better. But the thing is, if you don't have that ability, if you don't have those language or communication abilities, that kid's never going to figure out how to say the word eat or cookie or snack or whatever unless we directly teach them. So we intentionally target this deficit and we build this skill of asking, of communication. That's almost every kid we have there. So in religious, if a church came to take care of these kids, they would basically look at them as this group of sinners who are stealing and having tantrums and whatever, whereas we recognize that they don't have certain skills and we just have to teach. So yes, we have to reduce those behaviors because they can be dangerous to the kid or to other people or whatnot, get them in trouble or whatnot. But at the same time, we also realize they're not choosing to be bad. They're not sinners, if you will. They are, they don't know how to ask for what they need, basic needs like water or food or comfort, like the little sick kid. And so we just have to teach them. So we then build these behaviors, these adaptive skills side by side as we reduce the ones that are harmful to them or others. So that is, I guess, the point. I know as we got into mental health and whatnot and just kind of discussing that in and of itself, as I look at the application, religion in and of itself is not equipped to produce positive behavioral change because it is only focused on behavior reduction. It does not have a component a teaching component in to teach you the correct way to do things. I mean, they may try, but it's not going to focus on what actually needs to be taught.
Yep. And then all you're saying is we should put in place things to where it can do that.
Yes.
Yeah. I completely agree with you.
Well,
did you expect that?
No. But on that note, I would say that's pretty well what I've got for the discussion. I just feel like instead of changing I feel like instead of eradicating or just doing away with, I think within religion, it would help so much if we could identify why these behaviors are occurring and then find very pointed, specific interventions, even in religious terms, that we can apply to either help alleviate suffering or to teach new skills as we reduce behaviors. Just a much more intentional and objective approach as opposed to subjective and just telling people, just be happy, just behave, just stop being a sinner, just whatever. And instead give them intentional help, even if it's wrapped in religious ideology, still having that same core intervention that is targeting specifically what needs to be targeted instead of just kind of scrolling through a toolbox of things that might work.
Right. Yeah, and I think it would be a perfect process to be put in place, perfect tool set to be put in place in a clinical setting. And like you said before, if we did have these individuals in the churches too, it would be a great fit.
Absolutely.
Honestly. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for having me on. I've absolutely enjoyed this talk.
Yeah. You ready to eat some chicken?
I am absolutely ready to decimate some chicken.
All right, let's go.